Hello and welcome to another episode of Bridging the Gap podcast. Today we're going to discuss behavioral events and how turning those customer actions into some strategic insights actually yields the benefit for you as a customer with all this data that we're wanting to utilize. So a lot of companies don't realize the difference between just tracking general events within their ecosystem and within their apps and their APIs versus behavioral events. A lot of people think if I've got, say, Google Analytics or even a mix panel which just is generically tracking things, you've got all you need. You've got your events captured there. But that really does tell you a lot of things when a specific action is taken, and it's, I would argue, a little bit generic. But these behavioral events are where we're taking the intentionality to actually dig in and see things that are happening within an app or an API or a website that isn't just as simple as maybe a page view, but things as simple as, did a customer attempt cancellation? Because maybe they didn't complete cancellation, but they attempted it. So that gives you some nice insights. But these are the kind of things where it's a behavior, a behavior that the user has taken, which yields these actions you want to know. So that's where the difference between just page view or button click, those are explicit actions. But these behavioral things is when they do things that don't necessarily yield to a explicit action. Another good one I also like to do, although I don't want these to always be considered on the negative aspect, but it's a good reason, is involuntary churn. Capturing that thing is where maybe a customer didn't even update credit card information, or maybe they didn't even know they needed to update the information, but capturing that as an event allows you to even do communication back to the customer. So behavioral events are a little deeper than just explicit tapping the action. But that's where we want to head with this context, is what's the difference between a explicit user action versus a behavior. So tracking behavioral events, one of the key things with this is really understanding the difference between features you've deployed and whether or not they're getting utilized, things that the customers may have asked for that you implemented but then they didn't do, or assumptions and hypotheses that you as a product owner or someone running the company may have had and you put it out there. These behavioral events are what really yield that extra insight and data. One other facet I would add is you can also track what I would consider a customer lifetime journey much easier with a lot of these behavioral events. So we can start with the journey aspect of, yes, you can tell when a user creates an account in your system because sure, you have some database record that told you there's a thing there. But what if you want to track an event that actually says, well, they created the record, but they didn't follow through to the next step? How are you tracking that in the database directly other than just various status changes? And you don't know if that's really what they were expecting. So this is where within a journey, say you have a sign-up journey, you could say an account was created, maybe an email was verified, maybe they're doing a purchase on an e-commerce platform, so you could see they did that, or maybe they're doing a subscription and they started a trial, and then you want to know if it converted. These are behaviors that you're wanting to track and see where is the fall off in a journey. But I even go back to, as I said, things like, did a customer attempt cancellation? There's a big difference in a customer canceled versus the customer attempted. Say you have a cancellation screen where you want to get information. Well, just because they click and view that screen doesn't mean they canceled, but that could be a signal to you as a customer that maybe they're contemplating canceling. And if they do that, maybe if they do it once, you want to reach out to them. So that's an event that you can now track because the behavior was attempted cancellation. So maybe you actually want to send a message or an in-app message or an SMS or whatever mode you're communicating with this user. Or maybe you want to submit a discount coupon and see if you can keep them there. But this is where you can kind of create this engagement with the user on the basis of actions they took that, granted, don't get me wrong, it does start to broach on that little bit of creepy because you're kind of like, wait, you knew that I attempted to cancel, but if they're looking at cancellation and maybe you can early offer a discount or have customer support. You could be in enterprise software, and if your big client's leaving, maybe that's where your account manager now needs to reach out and see if maybe the relationship's not going where you want. But those kind of insights are really what drive you as a business to be able to take intentional action. And I would say quasi-proactive action versus retroactive, going, well, they canceled, now I got to win them back. That's a lot more effort than seeing if I can do something to just keep you and retain you. Yeah, one of the biggest questions in this is the tooling that you could utilize in here. Again, I early mentioned things like Google Analytics. Google Analytics is fine. It's telling you page views and maybe how long they're on a page and bounce rates, but that's not necessarily telling you what they're doing on the page while they're there. Are they interacting? Are they scrolling? This is where I think it's not just having like a GA tool on there, but there's other tools out there where you can do heat mapping and scroll mapping and click mapping to see, are they clicking on things? Maybe you had an image or an icon that looked like something they wanted to do. Well, if you're not tracking the fact that they're clicking on that, how would you know that that's a thing that could be, well, what we'd call creating rage clicks, because they expected it to do something and it didn't. So you could track it with click tracking, scroll tracking, heat map tracking. There's also systems out there. There's a multitude of CDPs. I mean, I personally like High Touch as a composable CDP because it has a lot of kind of downstream benefits. But with their event architecture and you institute all these behavioral events in there, that data flows directly into your warehouse, which, don't get me wrong, infers you have a data warehouse in place to be capturing these in the first place. But you would capture those events, it goes into your warehouse, and sure, you could absolutely create dashboards and things to this nature to see what's happening. That's not where you've operationalized this though. And this is why I mentioned high touch, because with the high touch side, you can trigger a multitude of things. If this event happens, send it into my email tool or send it into my SMS tool or send it into maybe my support tool that lets my team know what's happening. So you can kind of trigger these things now based on what's coming in. That's where you do have to go a little beyond just going, sure, we've captured the data. I mean, you have to get the data in there, but now you need the tooling, which is, again, as I say, seeing things in a chart and seeing what's happening and watching journey flows. I mean, that's very useful. It's not that it's not useful, but that's not really where you're taking the actions. You need tools, often in a form of a CDP, that's going to take that data, do something with it, let you communicate, take action, whatever it may be. But that's really one of the biggest things I would recommend for most everyone in this is have a tool, probably a CDP, that's going to let you take the action off of that event once it has happened. Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things here is where, like my company Morph, we really come in and help a client set up this entire data ecosystem, which, as I said, there's an inference that capturing the behavioral events needs to go somewhere. This is one of the biggest reasons why we really start with, having a data warehouse that should serve as your central source of truth for you to do these things with. That's why you have the warehouse. But the warehouse is just storage. That's not helping you. So this is why all these other things, getting the data in and getting the data out, is really important. So in these behavioral events, yes, you could have the systems in place that are capturing the data. You would have the warehouse in place that's storing the data. You would have the CDPs in place that are sending the data. Once you have this ecosystem, which again, that's what we really want to espouse. It's no one tool. You need this whole ecosystem. But once you have this going, this is really why I would say for many customers, they just assume, and I'd take this even one step further and say it's why I hate vanity metrics. It's one of my problems I have with a tool such as like say a Google Analytics. Again, nothing inherently wrong with it, but when people just want to go, how many people are on my site? That is indeed metrics, that is indeed analytics, but is that actionable? If I got 1 million people on my site and that's all I know, what do we do with that? It's where we want those behavioral events. I have 1 million people on my site and they're viewing this particular page and they're going into this particular flow or funnel and they're actually doing this action or not doing this action, like create a trial or purchase the thing or add something to their cart or whatever it is that's actually yielding revenue to your business. That's where the behavioral side of this really comes into play. Now, you could absolutely take all these things with the data layer on Google Analytics and do a bunch of tagging. I just tend to find that often these other systems implement a lot easier. But where this becomes so tacit is once they implement those actions. Again, I keep harping on the attempted cancellation reason that became a big insight that we actually helped a customer with because they had churn. Churn had actually spiked on a month over month basis. And they did indeed have churn questions. They wanted to ask the user, why are you leaving? And oftentimes they would say, oh, it's cost. And that just kind of was a catch-all. And that was the problem. What we wanted to know was, How often was the user looking at potentially canceling well before they canceled? Because now we can come in, as I mentioned, proactively, if you will, do something before they've left. That saved the company a ton of effort. Win back campaigns are already expensive because now you've already paid probably once to get them. So add that customer acquisition cost. They've left. You possibly had some kind of support issue. So that added to support costs. Now you want to put them back into some other marketing or win back campaign. So that's more customer acquisition costs. I mean, you're just kind of adding and adding all these costs versus what if you could programmatically reach out and go, hey, we see that you're, maybe this is not your exact verbiage, but we see that you're not happy with the service. Because they're attempting cancellation, you can interrupt or short circuit that, if you will, and maybe step in and proactively find out why are they looking at cancellation in the first place. Doing that proactive, so much cheaper to retain a customer than it is to acquire and then have to reacquire the customer. So that's a very, very tacit example. And again, I keep harping on that one, but that one was very palpable. Seeing the attempt of cancellation. Granted, that's in a subscription metric, so don't get me wrong. There is kind of the cart abandonment flows and everything else that you technically can indeed trigger these things if you're e-commerce, but there's a multitude of things that you can look at that are not user clicked this action. It's did they do this behavior, which is again the mental shift that you're actually trying to accomplish here. Yeah, when you're getting started on this, I think the biggest conundrum is often companies just assume I need to know everything I want to track. And I mean, if you do, that's a fantastic place. That means you probably started with a complete different level of intentionality than many other people. But as I said, often they don't even have a data warehouse. So thinking about what they're tracking, they don't even know where they would store it. So if we can get past the infrastructure problem and they have the ecosystem in place, there is a little bit of a give and a take or a catch-22 in this where I say start small, start with what you know you want to know, track those events. You can always add more events later. When you start establishing that, oh, well, when they do this, or I want to know if they do this, think if you're instituting feature toggling and did they even go to the page where the feature was, or did they toggle on the feature? I mean, these are the kind of behavioral events you'd want to do. You could absolutely implement that. And that's, again, start small and keep incrementing whatever you want to track, keep adding to it. The caveat or the catch-22 to that, though, and again, this is where you have a little bit of the urgency race. Behavioral events can't be repeated back in time. So if you weren't tracking it, the opportunity is gone. Now, that doesn't mean you can't start at some point. Starting at some point is better than not tracking at all. But if you all of a sudden are like, well, I'm really curious, were users using this last month, last quarter, last year, last version? Too bad. You can't really go back and start creating the events, but you can draw a proverbial line in the sand and start tracking at that point. This is where I'd say when we work with a company, one of the biggest things that we want to sit and really help them think through is a relatively robust starting point for their events. Again, I say relatively robust because it doesn't have to be everything under the sun, the kitchen sink, as it were. But we do want them to think a little beyond of like, well, sure, I want to know if, an order was made or an account was created, because that is the really, really low hanging fruit. We like to help them think through and have data as an early strategy in what they're thinking through so that they can go, yeah, there is probably, I don't know, 10, 15, maybe even 20 events that they're like, I'd like to know this. And then as they do this, and we often say we want you to be data driven and data curious. Well, that data curiosity is where all of a sudden you go, well, wait a minute, can I find this out too? Or you'll have other team members starting to go, well, I'd like to know what this did. And you go, well, we're not tracking that, but we can. And you start. So, I mean, it's never too late to start. And yet, ironically, you can never go back in time and get anything you haven't been tracking. So that's your urgency race. But that's what I tell them. Start small, start with what you know you need to know, and then let that curiosity drive the new things you'd really like to lean into. Thanks for attending another episode of Bridging the Gap podcast. I'm hoping that the understanding now of how behavioral events can really yield more actionable insights and more value to your company can actually get you some ROI. If you're curious about more, just reach out. We're happy to chat.